The blue and red lights cut through the humid night like a warning meant for someone else, until they weren't. The words came fast and low, sharp enough to sting. "I'll ruin your life." They weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. Spoken inches away, calm and confident, they carried the weight of a promise. On the cracked asphalt of a quiet American street, a single sentence turned a routine stop into something far more dangerous. And no one, not the officer, not the onlookers, not even the woman standing there with her hands visible, yet understood how quickly the balance of power was about to flip. Chief Angela Brooks stood beneath a flickering streetlight, dressed plainly in dark slacks and a gray blazer, the kind of outfit designed to disappear into a crowd. She had landed in the city less than 48 hours earlier, her transfer finalized after months of closed-door meetings and political tension she hadn't caused but was now expected to manage. Tonight was supposed to be simple, a late drive to clear her head, a few minutes alone before the weight of a new badge, a new department, and a new set of expectations settled fully onto her shoulders. Instead, Officer Mark Reynolds' patrol car idled behind her sedan, its engine rumbling like a distant threat, while his boots scraped impatiently against the pavement. Reynolds had already decided who she was before he reached her window. He saw the car, the neighborhood, the time of night, and filled in the rest without asking. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed, used to people shrinking when he stepped closer. Angela noticed everything, the way his hand hovered near his belt, the tightness in his jaw, the slight smirk when she asked, politely, why she'd been stopped. She answered his questions calmly, her tone measured, giving nothing away. Years in law enforcement had taught her when silence was protection and when it was strategy. Across the street, Jason Lee slowed his steps, phone already in his hand, sensing the tension before he could explain it. From the glow of a nearby cruiser, dispatcher Emily Carter watched the live feed flicker on her screen back at headquarters, frowning as the audio crackled. Captain David Miller, finishing paperwork upstairs, hadn't yet noticed the alert icon blinking red, and Lieutenant Sarah Collins, Internal Affairs, was still at home, unaware that her night was about to be interrupted. When Reynolds leaned in and delivered the threat, soft, deliberate, unmistakable, Angela felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear, but recognition. She'd heard variations of those words before, had investigated them, disciplined officers over them, testified about the damage they caused. She met his eyes, steady and unflinching, and said nothing. The silence unsettled him more than an argument would have. The street seemed to hold its breath, the city itself pausing, as the consequences of one sentence began to move, unseen but unstoppable, toward the man who believed he was in control. Officer Mark Reynolds mistook Angela Brooks's silence for compliance, and in that misreading, he grew bolder. He straightened his shoulders and took a half step closer, enough to invade her space without quite crossing the line that training manuals warned against. The streetlight above them hummed faintly, casting uneven shadows across his face, and Angela could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the quiet thrill of control, the assumption that nothing about this encounter would ever reach beyond this block. He asked again where she was coming from, his tone clipped now, irritation creeping in as her answers remained calm and precise. She gave him facts, not explanations, each word carefully chosen, each breath steady. Inside, she cataloged everything, the phrasing of his questions, the way his hand brushed his radio, the subtle shift in his posture when she didn't react the way he expected. Across the street, Jason Lee stopped walking altogether. He leaned against a parked car, phone raised casually but deliberately, the camera angled to capture both faces. He'd grown up in this neighborhood and had learned early which moments deserved witnesses. The officer's body language set off alarms in his mind, and when Reynolds' voice dropped again, low, controlled, dangerous, Jason felt his stomach tighten. He zoomed in just enough to catch the words, the threat hanging in the air like exhaust fumes. A car passed slowly behind him, its driver craning to look, sensing something off but unwilling to get involved. Back at headquarters, dispatcher Emily Carter adjusted her headset, replaying the last few seconds of the live feed. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she frowned, listening closely. The officer's tone didn't match the routine traffic stop code that scrolled across her screen. She increased the volume, heart rate ticking up as the words became unmistakable. Emily had routed hundreds of stops like this, but something about this one felt wrong in a way that policy language couldn't quite describe. She flagged the feed and sent a silent alert upstairs, the system ping echoing through Captain David Miller's office. Miller looked up from his desk, irritation flashing across his face before focus replaced it. He leaned toward his monitor, eyes narrowing as the video filled the screen. He recognized Reynolds immediately. Solid record, a few complaints, nothing that had stuck. But Miller also recognized the tone, the posture, the line officers crossed when they forgot they were being watched. He turned up the audio just in time to catch the tail end of the threat, his jaw tightening as he leaned back in his chair. On the street, Angela finally spoke, her voice even, almost conversational. "Is there a reason I'm being detained, officer?" The question was simple, procedural, devastating in its calm. Reynolds hesitated, just for a second, thrown off by her composure. He hadn't noticed the phone across the street. He hadn't noticed the quiet escalation moving through radios and screens. He only felt the sudden, subtle shift in the air, the sense that this stop was no longer entirely his. Reynolds cleared his throat and glanced back toward his cruiser, buying himself a moment that he didn't realize he no longer had. The radio on his shoulder crackled softly, a routine status update from another unit a few blocks away, but the sound grounded him in a confidence built over years of unchallenged authority. He turned back to Angela with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes, and told her to remain where she was while he figured a few things out. The phrasing was deliberately vague, a tactic meant to stretch time and nerves at the same time. Angela nodded slightly, not in agreement but acknowledgement, and folded her hands in front of her, a posture that was non-threatening and deliberate. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in, the familiar sensation of being evaluated not just as a civilian, but as a symbol she had never volunteered to be. Jason Lee's phone vibrated as a message notification popped up, a friend asking where he was. He ignored it, eyes locked on the scene unfolding in front of him. The officer's movements had become sharper, less controlled, and Jason knew from experience that those were the moments that mattered most. He adjusted his grip, angling the camera to capture the cruiser's number and the officer's face clearly. The night air carried every sound, the scrape of Reynolds' boots, the faint buzz of streetlights, the distant siren wailing somewhere across town. None of it drowned out the tension that now felt thick enough to touch. At headquarters, Captain David Miller stood up from his desk, chair rolling back abruptly. He replayed the clip again, slower this time, listening carefully to every word, every pause. The threat was unmistakable. His stomach tightened, not just with concern, but with the knowledge of what this meant for a department already under scrutiny. He grabbed his radio and keyed the mic, his voice steady but firm as he called for Reynolds' immediate status update. There was a brief delay, just long enough to be telling, before Reynolds responded, his tone suddenly more formal, more cautious. Miller didn't miss the shift. Lieutenant Sarah Collins's phone rang on her kitchen counter, cutting through the quiet of her evening. She frowned at the caller ID and answered, already mentally switching gears as Miller summarized the situation. As internal affairs, she had heard it all before, but something in Miller's voice told her this wasn't routine. She asked him to send the footage immediately and stood, grabbing her keys, professionalism overriding fatigue. By the time she hung up, the story was already forming in her mind. Not conclusions, but questions, the kind that demanded answers sooner rather than later. On the street, Angela watched Reynolds pace near his cruiser, pretending to check his computer while his jaw worked as if he were chewing on frustration. She noticed the subtle change in his demeanor, the way his shoulders stiffened when the radio crackled again, this time with Captain Miller's voice requesting clarification. For the first time, Reynolds looked unsettled. Angela met his eyes when he turned back toward her, and in that brief moment, he sensed, without understanding why, that this encounter was slipping beyond his control. The words he'd spoken minutes earlier lingered between them, heavy now with consequences neither of them could fully see yet, but both could feel approaching fast. The arrival of the second patrol car should have been routine, but nothing about the moment felt ordinary. Its headlights swept across the scene, briefly illuminating Jason Lee as he stepped back, careful to keep his phone steady and visible. Officer Reynolds stiffened, his earlier swagger replaced by a tightly wound alertness that betrayed his nerves. The responding officer nodded to Reynolds, waiting for instruction, but none came right away. Instead, Reynolds took an extra second to compose himself, smoothing his uniform, as if appearance alone could restore the authority he felt slipping. Angela Brooks noticed the delay and the subtle power shift it signaled. Backup had arrived not because of danger, but because someone somewhere had decided this encounter needed more eyes on it. Reynolds approached Angela again, his voice noticeably restrained now. He told her there had been a misunderstanding and asked, almost casually, if she would mind answering a few more questions. The threat from minutes earlier hung unacknowledged between them, heavy and unresolved. Angela looked past him briefly, taking in the second cruiser, the watching bystanders, the glow of phone screens. She replied evenly, repeating her earlier question about the legal basis for her detention. Her calm wasn't performative, it was rooted in long experience, in knowing that moments like this revealed more about an officer's character than any internal evaluation ever could. At headquarters, Captain David Miller watched the live feed split into multiple camera angles, his expression hardening. He could see Reynolds' attempt to walk things back, the sudden shift in tone that came only after oversight appeared. Miller keyed his radio again, this time instructing the backup officer to stand by and await further direction. His decision was already forming, shaped by policy, by precedent, and by the simple clarity of what he had heard with his own ears. He forwarded the footage to Lieutenant Sarah Collins, adding a short note that spoke volumes without embellishment. Immediate review required. Sarah listened to the audio in her car as she drove, eyes focused on the road while her mind dissected every inflection. The threat wasn't shouted or emotional, it was controlled, deliberate, and that made it worse. She'd seen careers end over less, and she knew how quickly public trust eroded when moments like this were mishandled. She called Emily Carter at dispatch to confirm timestamps and ensure the footage was preserved, her voice calm and methodical as she laid the groundwork for what was coming. On the street, Reynolds' radio crackled again, this time with an order he hadn't expected. Captain Miller's voice was firm, leaving no room for interpretation. Reynolds was to step back and allow the backup officer to take over the stop. The words landed like a blow. Reynolds' eyes flicked to Angela, then to the watching crowd, awareness dawning too late. He took a slow step backward, jaw clenched, as the other officer moved forward, professional and neutral. Angela met Miller's distant gaze through the lens of the camera, her expression unchanged, but inside she felt the shift settle fully into place. The threat that had once seemed so certain now sounded hollow, its echo replaced by the unmistakable sound of authority reasserting itself, this time not in Reynolds' favor. As the backup officer took control of the stop, the atmosphere changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable, like the pressure drop before a storm finally breaks. Officer Reynolds stood near his cruiser now, hands resting awkwardly on his belt, eyes fixed straight ahead as if refusing to acknowledge the woman he had threatened minutes earlier. The new officer spoke with rehearsed neutrality, asking Angela routine questions in a tone that lacked both suspicion and aggression, and Angela answered just as calmly as before, offering the same facts, the same steady cadence. Around them, the small crowd had grown, drivers slowing, pedestrians pausing, Jason Lee still filming, his phone unwavering. He could sense the shift, too, the unspoken recognition that something significant was unfolding, something that would not be quietly forgotten by morning. At headquarters, Captain David Miller made his decision official. He documented the incident in real time, fingers moving quickly over the keyboard as he logged the threat verbatim, attaching the audio and video feeds without commentary. He'd learned long ago that facts carried more weight than opinions, especially when careers and credibility were on the line. Emily Carter watched the system update from her desk, her earlier unease now replaced by a focused professionalism as she routed notifications to the appropriate channels. The department's internal machinery was moving, deliberate and unstoppable once engaged. Lieutenant Sarah Collins pulled into the parking lot just as the call log finalized. She remained in her car for a moment, replaying the audio again, eyes closed this time, absorbing not just the words but the confidence behind them. She knew officers like Reynolds, not caricatures, not monsters, but men who had grown comfortable believing the uniform insulated them from consequence. She stepped out of the car, straightened her jacket, and headed inside, already preparing the questions she would ask and the silences she would let linger. Back on the street, the backup officer returned Angela's license and told her she was free to go. The words landed softly but carried enormous weight. Angela accepted the documents, meeting the officer's eyes with a brief nod, then turned toward her car. As she opened the door, Reynolds finally looked at her directly. For a fraction of a second, something crossed his face. Confusion, resentment, maybe even doubt. But he said nothing. Angela paused, just long enough to let the moment settle, then got into her car and closed the door gently, without hurry. Jason Lee lowered his phone only after her taillights disappeared down the street. He exhaled, realizing how tightly he'd been holding his breath. Behind him, Reynolds' radio crackled once more, Captain Miller's voice cutting through the night with a calm authority that left no room for argument. Reynolds was instructed to return to headquarters immediately. He acknowledged the order, voice flat, eyes fixed on the pavement. The streetlights continued to hum overhead as the scene slowly dispersed, but the incident itself refused to fade, already embedded in recordings, reports, and the minds of everyone who had witnessed how quickly power could shift when accountability stepped into the light. Reynolds drove back to headquarters in silence, the patrol car's interior suddenly feeling smaller than it ever had before. The dashboard lights glowed a sterile blue, reflecting off the windshield as familiar streets blurred past, but nothing about the drive felt routine. He replayed the encounter in fragments, the woman's calm stare, the way the backup officer had taken over without question, the unmistakable tone in Captain Miller's voice when the order came through. He told himself it had been blown out of proportion, that words were just words, that he dealt with tougher situations before. Yet beneath the rationalizations, a quieter realization took shape. He had never before been pulled back so quickly, so publicly, and he had never felt this exposed. At headquarters, Captain David Miller stood near the conference room, arms crossed, watching through the glass as Reynolds walked in. The officer's posture was rigid, his movements precise, as if discipline alone could shield him now. Miller didn't raise his voice or offer commentary. He simply gestured toward the room and waited. Emily Carter glanced up from dispatch as Reynolds passed, their eyes meeting briefly before she looked away, unwilling to offer comfort or judgment. The building hummed with late-night activity, but the usual camaraderie felt distant, replaced by an awareness that something serious was unfolding. Lieutenant Sarah Collins joined them moments later, carrying a tablet tucked under her arm. She greeted Miller with a nod and took a seat across from Reynolds, setting the device down deliberately. She explained the process in clear, measured terms. This was an administrative inquiry, the footage would be reviewed, and Reynolds would have the opportunity to provide his account. Her tone was neutral, but the structure of her words left no ambiguity about the gravity of the situation. Reynolds listened, jaw tight, hands clasped in front of him, the confidence he'd worn earlier now reduced to a brittle stillness. As the footage played on the screen, the room fell quiet. Reynolds watched himself from an angle he'd never considered, heard his own voice deliver the threat with a calmness that unsettled even him. He shifted in his chair, starting to speak, then stopping, as if the words he'd prepared no longer fit the reality unfolding in front of him. Collins paused the video at the exact moment the threat was spoken, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Angela Brooks sat alone in her temporary apartment, city lights glowing through the window as she replayed the night in her own mind. She hadn't identified herself, hadn't corrected the assumptions made about her, and she wondered briefly how different the encounter might have been if she had. Her phone buzzed with a message from Captain Miller, brief and professional, informing her that the officer had been relieved of duty pending review. Angela set the phone down, exhaling slowly. The city outside carried on as usual, unaware that in a small conference room across town, a man's certainty was unraveling under the weight of his own recorded words. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of headquarters, exposing every detail the night shift had softened. Officer Mark Reynolds sat alone in the locker room, uniform folded neatly in his bag, the absence of his badge on his chest feeling heavier than its weight ever had. The official notice lay open on the bench beside him, the language precise and impersonal, relieved of duty pending further investigation. He read it again, slower this time, as if repetition might change its meaning. Around him, the sounds of the building waking up, footsteps, muffled conversations, the clink of coffee cups felt oddly distant, as though he were already removed from the life he'd known inside these walls. Captain David Miller moved through the corridors with the focused calm of someone accustomed to pressure. He fielded calls from city officials, legal counsel, and the department's public information office, repeating the same facts with disciplined restraint. There would be no speculation, no defensive language, no attempt to soften what had been captured on video. He understood the stakes, not just for the department's reputation, but for the trust it was supposed to serve. Each decision felt weighted, deliberate, the product of years spent watching small failures turn into large scandals when leadership hesitated. Lieutenant Sarah Collins met with her team, distributing assignments with quiet efficiency. She emphasized timelines, evidence preservation, and consistency, her voice steady even as she acknowledged the scrutiny this case would attract. Internally, she noted the details that mattered, the officer's prior complaints, the training records, the pattern of behavior that might or might not emerge. She avoided conclusions, but she also avoided denial. The footage spoke clearly, and her role was to ensure nothing distorted its meaning. Across town, Angela Brooks stepped into City Hall for her first full day of meetings as the new police chief. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on her. She listened as council members referenced the incident carefully, testing the waters, watching her reaction. Angela responded with measured clarity, emphasizing procedure, accountability, and the importance of addressing misconduct without defensiveness. She did not mention her role in the incident, choosing instead to let the facts stand on their own. Her restraint drew quiet respect, even from those who had been skeptical of her appointment. Jason Lee watched the story unfold online from his kitchen table, his video now circulating far beyond his neighborhood. Comments flooded in, anger, validation, disbelief, and he felt the strange weight of having documented a moment that others were now dissecting. He hadn't set out to make a statement, he'd simply recognized the importance of witnessing. As the morning wore on, the narrative solidified. An officer's threat, swift action, a system responding in real time. And in the spaces between headlines and official statements, the city began to reckon with how close it had come to letting one sentence pass unnoticed, and how different this time felt from all the others. By midday, the conference room on the third floor had become the center of gravity for the department, its long table crowded with folders, tablets, and the quiet tension of people who understood the implications of every word spoken inside. Lieutenant Sarah Collins sat at the head, methodically guiding the review while Captain David Miller observed, occasionally interjecting to clarify timelines or procedures. Officer Reynolds was not present. His attorney had advised him to wait, and his absence hung in the room like an unanswered question. The footage played again, this time dissected frame by frame, audio isolated and replayed until there was no ambiguity left to hide behind. No one raised their voice. They didn't need to. The evidence spoke with a calm authority that stripped away excuses. Downstairs, the Public Information Office drafted its statement, careful and precise. Emily Carter listened as it was read aloud, recognizing phrases designed to reassure without inflaming, to acknowledge without conceding more than facts allowed. She thought about the moment she'd flagged the feed, how instinct had guided her hand before policy ever caught up. The realization unsettled her, not with fear, but with responsibility. She understood now how fragile the line was between a routine shift and a defining moment, and how easily either could slip away unnoticed. Angela Brooks returned to headquarters that afternoon, moving through the building with the quiet confidence of someone who knew both the culture and its cracks. She hadn't planned to address the incident so directly, but leadership rarely waited for perfect timing. In a closed-door meeting with Miller and Collins, she spoke candidly about expectations, about how swiftly situations escalated when power went unchecked. She did not name Reynolds, nor did she need to. Her presence alone reframed the conversation, reminding everyone that accountability was not an abstract ideal, but a daily practice. Outside, reporters gathered near the entrance, cameras poised, questions already rehearsed. Jason Lee stood among them briefly, unrecognized, listening as speculation layered itself over fact. He noticed how quickly narratives formed, how easily nuance was lost once a story left the control of those who had lived it. When the official statement was released, confirming that the officer had been relieved of duty within minutes of the threat, a murmur rippled through the crowd, surprise mixed with something like relief. Inside the building, Reynolds' locker remained closed, untouched, a small but telling detail. His absence was felt in glances exchanged in hallways, in conversations that stopped when someone else walked by. The department continued to function, calls answered, reports filed, patrols dispatched, but an undercurrent ran through it all. For the first time in a long while, the response to misconduct had not been delayed, debated, or deflected. It had been immediate. And as the day stretched on, it became clear that this speed, this refusal to look away, was what unsettled people most, because it hinted at a future where moments like that night on the street might no longer end quietly. The hearing was scheduled quietly, without the spectacle that usually accompanied cases like this, yet the tension surrounding it was unmistakable. Officer Mark Reynolds sat at the far end of the room, suit pressed, expression carefully neutral, his attorney murmuring occasional reminders in a low voice. Across from him, Lieutenant Sarah Collins organized her notes with practiced precision, the evidence laid out not as an accusation, but as a record. Timestamps, transcripts, training guidelines, prior counseling memos. Captain David Miller took a seat along the wall, observing rather than participating, his presence a reminder that this was not about personalities, but systems and standards. The air felt dense, weighted by the understanding that every word spoken here would echo far beyond the room. Angela Brooks entered without announcement, her presence shifting the room's focus immediately. She took a seat beside the city's legal counsel, acknowledging no one directly, her posture relaxed but attentive. For the first time since that night, Reynolds looked at her with something approaching recognition, though still without comprehension of who she truly was. As the audio was played once more, the threat filled the room, stripped of context and emotion, stark in its simplicity. Angela watched Reynolds carefully, noting the tightening around his eyes, the way his jaws set as if bracing against an impact he could no longer avoid. Sarah asked measured questions, allowing Reynolds space to explain his intent, his perception of the encounter. He spoke of stress, of misunderstandings, of a long shift in a difficult neighborhood, words that had been used many times before in many similar rooms. No one interrupted him. When he finished, Sarah referenced departmental policy, highlighting the explicit language officers were trained never to use, regardless of circumstance. She did not argue. She aligned his words against standards he had agreed to uphold. The contrast was damning in its simplicity. Outside the room, reporters waited, their presence a constant pressure even through closed doors. Jason Lee stood among them again, not as a witness this time, but as someone watching accountability unfold in real time.
He noticed how differently officials spoke now, less evasive, more grounded, aware that the public had already seen too much to be placated by vague assurances. When the hearing recessed, the decision was not announced immediately, but its direction felt inevitable. Reynolds gathered his things slowly, avoiding eye contact as he left the room. Angela remained seated for a moment longer, exchanging a quiet word with Miller and Collins before standing. As she stepped into the hallway, the building's noise seemed to rush back in, phones ringing, footsteps echoing, life continuing. Yet beneath it all, something fundamental had shifted. The process was nearing its end, and soon the truth of who held power and how swiftly it could be withdrawn would be made unmistakably clear.
The announcement came just before dusk, delivered in a tone that was deliberately unremarkable, as if the department understood that the gravity of the decision didn't require embellishment. Officer Mark Reynolds' employment was terminated following the administrative review, the finding citing a clear violation of conduct standards and an abuse of authority inconsistent with the values the department claimed to uphold. Captain David Miller read the statement once before it was released, then again after, listening for anything that sounded defensive or incomplete. Satisfied, he approved it and watched as the words moved from an internal document to a public reckoning, carried instantly across screens and conversations throughout the city. Angela Brooks stood at the podium later that evening, the city seal behind her, cameras humming softly in the gathering dark. She addressed the crowd with the same composure she had shown on the street days earlier, acknowledging the pain such incidents caused and the responsibility leadership bore in responding to them. Only near the end did she reveal what many had not yet realized, that she was the woman involved in the stop, that she had experienced the threat firsthand, not as a hypothetical or a report, but as a citizen standing alone under a streetlight. The admission rippled through the room, surprise giving way to a heavy, reflective silence. Angela did not dramatize it. She didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. In the back of the room, Jason Lee lowered his phone, feeling the story settle into something more complete than a viral clip ever could. He thought about how easily the night could have ended differently, how often it had ended differently for others. Emily Carter watched the press conference from dispatch, her shift nearing its end, the familiar glow of screens now carrying a deeper meaning. Lieutenant Sarah Collins closed her case file, the finality of it tempered by the knowledge that this was only one moment in a much longer effort. As the city lights came on, life resumed its rhythms, traffic humming, storefronts glowing, conversations unfolding in kitchens and living rooms. Yet something lingered in the air, an awareness that accountability had arrived swiftly this time, without delay or deflection. Reynolds' threat, once spoken with certainty, now stood in quiet contrast to the reality that followed. And in that space between words and consequences, the city found itself confronting a new understanding of power, how it could be challenged, how it could be checked, and how quickly it could disappear when the truth was allowed to stand in the open.